We're in my loft in New York, where I have lived since 1974. My husband Max was hired to teach at Cal Arts the first year in a former convent in Burbank, temporary quarters. The following year they moved to their permanent campus in Valencia. And I was a faculty wife. I went with him, with our 1-year-old toddler. I never had a woman studio art teacher, ever.
Any
Not
mentors?
at Carnegie Mellon and not at Columbia University. There weren't any. And I never thought about it. Yes, there are few women artists who were in the art history, but I didn't have any consciousness that there was this huge gap, and it just all changed that year. It just all changed. We were invited to a faculty party at the home of Alan Capro, and I didn't know very many people. And this woman started talking to me who was there with a young child, a faculty wife. Her name was Phyllis Stein. She was married to a philosopher named Maurice Stein, who'd been brought out to teach in critical studies, as was Max. And she said, "I'm starting a consciousness raising group. Would you like to join?" And I said, "What's that?" So what she did was she went to the Women's Center in Santa Monica and looked for women who wanted to form a group. And that was how the group was formed. And so it wasn't a group like some of the groups of my friends in New York with other artists. These were women who had different ages, different professions, different experiences. But it didn't matter. The basic consciousness raising process works. You choose a subject for the night, and you go around the room and each address it from your own experience. And then, when everyone's done speaking, there's a discussion about it afterward. And what you find out is the commonality of your experience and the culture. They're your basic CR subjects. How do you feel about your body? How do you feel about your mother? Very, very basic subjects. And within a couple of months, we were all, totally radicalized. I was angry all the time. I was unpresentable at dinner parties because some man would say something that would just tick me off, and I couldn't control myself. I would just blast the guy. I was so angry. But I think that happened to a lot of women. A lot of marriages broke up. In my New York consciousness raising group, I was the only one who stayed married. Paul and Mimi were very influential in bringing Max out. They were very old friends of his. And Mimi was hearing about my consciousness raising, and meanwhile, she was going up to Fresno and seeing what Judy Chicago was doing there and getting into very intense discussions with her. My issues were not so much about art at that time. They were about how to negotiate being a wife and mother and artist, and rethinking all of the assumptions I'd made and growing up, and rethinking the kinds of experiences I had, the kinds of role models I had. But I'm going to tell you a story now. So Mimi invited me to a brunch, and the brunch was at June Wayne's. I had never met June Wayne, and I had never met any of the other women there, some of whom are very dear friends to this day. One was Moira Roth, one was Claire Spark, who had a program on Pacifica Radio about the arts called The Sour Apple Tree. One was Bev O'Neill, who was an art historian, and she became the provost at Cal Arts. One was Judy Chicago, but there was a very intense discussion about the projects that each of these women were going to do. And each of them had a project, an educational project, a research project, something about feminism. And then when it came to me, I didn't have a project. And Mimi started yelling at me and saying, all you do is talk about consciousness raising and you're not doing anything. You can imagine. And I felt publicly humiliated. And I remember holding back the tears. And she said, kind of put up or shut up. I'm tired of this already. And so I said, well, what do you want me to do? And all of a sudden, she and Judy Chicago were all over me. You're going to organize the Women Artists of Los Angeles. Well, I didn't know any except the ones in that room. But everybody gave me lists, and everyone I called gave me more names. And I believe I called 65 women. And the first meeting was in this apartment that we had rented in Ocean Park near Santa Monica. And it was a small apartment. And I had turned the bedroom into a studio, and everybody was crowded around in the living room and standing. And we went around the room and everyone introduced themselves. And I was told afterward that a lot of these women didn't know that some of the other women were artists. They knew them as wives of male artists. And some of them introduced themselves with their own names, and the others had only known them with the names of their husbands. So it seems like that was a very important evening that night. And we talked about what everybody wanted to do. And a number of consciousness-raising groups were formed out of that larger group. And one of them lasted almost 20 years, I think. And some of them were very interested in the idea of feminist education. And we, as a larger group, decided to tackle the Los Angeles County Museum because somebody brought the catalog of the Art and Technology Show, which was a very big project there, and a lot of money, a lot of time had gone into it. On the cover of the catalog was a grid of faces, and they were all men. And I believe that they were all white men, too. And the women were absolutely enraged. And that was the first, action in the Los Angeles art world at that museum around that show. We made a list of demands. We went to the museum and we counted all the works on the walls. Then another day we went to the library and went through all the catalogs of previous shows. And I think I may have this wrong. This is how I remember it because they've now found some of the documents. But I believe the only solo show a woman had had there up until then was Dorothea Lange, and it was decades earlier. In any case, the statistics couldn't have been worse. And no one ever challenged them. I mean, we just did them by counting. And so we demanded that women be on the board of trustees, that all exhibitions be 50-50, the collection be 50-50. We had a list of demands. And we also demanded that they do an historic show of women artists of the past, which is the one thing that they did do. And there were negotiations between the women in the group and people from the museum. That was after I left. And one of the things that came out of it was the exhibition Women Artists 1550 to 1950, which was curated by Linda Nochlin and Ann Sutherland Harris. And I think it actually came into being about 5 years after the initial demonstrations. And the other thing is that there was a press conference. And we had the women in the group weren't only artists, there were filmmakers and journalists. And so we had a lot of media savvy people in the group. And when we had the press conference, there was a lot of media there and it got covered. It was on the radio, it was in the newspapers. I think it was on the evening news. And it was embarrassing for them. And they were taken by surprise. And that's why they met with the group. We had meetings and we also had committees. And committees to write the statement, committees to do the research, committees to and I remember when we were setting up things for the press, we divided it so that it would not always be the same voice. So certain people would speak for this program and certain people would speak to this reporter, and we tried very hard to spread that around. I was on a radio show with a couple of the other women, and I'd never done that before. And the night before, I couldn't sleep. I was terrified. And we went on, I don't know if it was 20 minutes, a half an hour. And when it was over, I was so disappointed. I couldn't wait to go back on the radio. I had so much more to say, And at the end of the year, Max decided that we would go. I was very unhappy and resistant. At the end of the year, I desperately wanted to stay. I was so involved in things, and he was ready to go. One of the things I became very interested in while in LA, which I worked on with my friend Gila, and she found the notes this week. And I always talk about this. I don't know if she does, but we were looking at the language of art criticism and art history. And we were going through art magazines and underlining adjectives, because adjectives like decorative, sweet, pretty were always pejorative. Whereas if it was tough and strong and potent, it was a positive. And so they had a value to them. They had a hierarchy to them. And we started underlining them and looking at whether those negative words were applied in reviews of women's work more, and those positive gender-loaded words were more in male reviews. And I don't know, we never finished it. It still interests me. And actually, that was one of the things that interested me the most, was the rhetoric around art and the gender of language around art. And I was particularly interested in the notion of the decorative, even though that wasn't what I was doing at that time in the work. Around 73, I started introducing patterns into my work. And it started, we went to Mexico for the summer, our little family. Max was doing some research on the Mexican mural painters. And I kept a notebook, and I did pencil drawings of every pattern I saw, whether it was on objects of daily life or whether it was on the facade of pre-Columbian temples. It could be something woven, it could be tiles, and I just kept these. And then I came back to, that was the summer of 73. Then I came back to New York and started introducing them into these large abstract paintings of mine. So there would be passages of, it was sort of texture that became pattern. From about 72 on, I was doing these kinds of dots and dashes, textures to build up the surfaces, and then they turned into patterns. And by the time I went to Mexico, I was looking for that. And a group of us found each other, which you know about, the pattern decoration group. But the only one I knew before that was Mimi, and Mimi and I started having conversations about the decorative arts. And she was very focused on women's traditional arts. I was looking at all the decorative arts, and that the word decorative was always in my education the worst thing you could say about a painting. You know, like say you would do anything to avoid being called decorative. And then once we embraced the word, it was not a problem anymore. It was like a badge of honor or something. But that consciousness went back to Los Angeles about the language. It just took me a couple of years to figure out how to put it into my work. I had friends in the New York women artist groups before I moved to LA, but I was not part of it. It really started in '69 here. I was friends with Mae Stevens and Nancy Spiro, who were in WAR, Women Artists Revolution, and I heard about their activities, but I had a baby and I didn't get involved until Los Angeles. I think there was a lot of communication back and forth. But there were demonstrations at the Whitney, and we heard about that in Los Angeles, and so that information was out there. So I immediately wanted to join one of those groups when I came back to New York, because I wanted to replace this incredible experience. And that's what I always tell my students. You're not going to make it on your own. Form a support community. Keep the dialogue going. It's everything. It's been everything for me. Everything I've ever learned or had as an artist has been in some way the result of this network of communications. Well, I have an addiction to groups ever since then, which I didn't necessarily have before. But that first experience was so heady for me that I keep getting involved in groups all my life, not all the time, but very often. And at its best, collaboration, because that's what we're talking about, in my experience, creates something much better than any one person or any 2 or 3 people could do. At its worst, it's very inefficient and a big waste of everybody's time. So you never know. Depends on the dynamics, the chemistry of the people involved. We took it into our own hands. I mean, women curated shows, women formed galleries, and you know, anyone who said there wasn't any good work by women, we proved it wasn't true. There was all this fabulous work by women out there. But we were the ones who we had to do everything. We did our own magazines, we did our own exhibition spaces. I think that I've always felt that I was very lucky to have participated in that moment. And that my generation is like a special generation because we all went through that experience somewhere at that time. And it doesn't leave you. And was much, much harder for previous generations. The women had to really be male identified to succeed. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And I know some of those older women, and they were male identified. And we became women identified, and we had a very strong support system. And it was a moment of such optimism and enthusiasm and energy. We thought we could change the world. The world doesn't change that fast, but we did change some things.